While writing up the history of my husband's maternal Caithness family, the Alls, one figure emerged as elusive: Janet, his great-grand-aunt. Researching her life brought me into close contact with the great issues of the 19th century: migration, the bonds of family and county of origin, and of course slavery, a topic very much under scrutiny at the present time. I was fortunate to have at hand a book, Memorials of Caithness Ministers, written by an old relative. One of the ministers featured was Janet's brother, the Reverend Alexander Oal, who became the Free Church minister in Alrig parish. Janet Oal, known as Jessie, later called Auld, was one of 5 children: Alexander, James, John Gunn, and William. Their parents were John Oal and Janet Gunn. Father John Oal was a man of sterling character and ability, and many careers. He was held in high esteem by those who knew him. He built and owned extensive house property in the town of Wick. A wine and spirit merchant, he had licensed premises in Louisborough Street. He married late in life and died when his children were young. There is a stone in the old Wick cemetery to John Oal's own parents, William Oal and Barbara Laird. Alexander, later the Reverend, was born in the farmhouse at Ulster, his father at that time being tacksman of the district. The tacksmen in those days had a 19 or 20-year lease of the land, part of which they occupied themselves, and sublet the remainder to tenants for a money rent or for payment in grain or in service. Being left a widow with young children, Mother Janet made every effort to give her sons the best education possible, sending them to Wick Parish School and thence into careers in the law and the ministry. There is no information on Jessie's education, but she found, or was found for her, a suitable husband, marrying John Gunn, lately of the island of Jamaica, in 1834. John Gunn was the son of Aeneas Gunn Tacher and Catherine Innes. John erected a stone in memory of his parents in Wick, and also of his brother George, a doctor of medicine who had died in Jamaica in 1826, aged 25. This unnamed photo in the possession of the family may possibly be of Jessie, but even if it's not, it gives an impression of what ladies looked like, young ladies looked like at the time. We do know that this is a miniature of William Gunn, Jessie's uncle. Both of Jessie's uncles, James and William, were army officers. William was with the 18th Regiment of Foot, known as the Royal Irish. In 1805 to 15, they were based in Jamaica. This may or may not be relevant to the story. Jessie's uncle, Alexander, was a well-known fiery preacher in Wotton. So what was life like in Jamaica at the time for John? I turned to the diary of Lady Nugent, the governor's wife. She was initially shocked to see the laxity of white British colonialists in dress, manners, and attitude to the servants and slaves. She even noticed them taking on a Jamaican drawl like the coloured population. However, by the end of her stay, she herself had adapted her clothes to suit the climate and became a champion of the oppressed The Earl of Baccaris, Alexander Lindsay, an army officer, was a visitor to Lady Nugent's household. He was one of her targets for his gross table manners and his insistence that his pet dog ate at the table. In the Clan Gun Centre in Caithness, an exhibit helps fill in the details of John Gunn's time in Jamaica. It is the Trelawney sword, presented to him, ironically enough, by the men of John Gunn's company of the local militia. The sword had been presented to the Gun Museum by a Don Ross of Boston. In Jamaica, John Gunn lived in New Mills and joined the Masons in Montego Bay. He spent nearly 20 years there, where he worked as an attorney, operating primarily in the parishes of Trelawney and St. James. In 1831, he was responsible for 5 plantations, on which a total of 1,163 enslaved people lived and worked. He was effectively the factor for absentee land and plantation owners living in Britain. He resided in St. James, being recorded as owning 4 enslaved persons himself. In 1831, Captain John Gunn was court-martialed in Jamaica for his part in quelling, too enthusiastically, the slave uprising. He ordered the summary execution of a slave called John Allen, although that slave and others had been pardoned not long before the shooting. Reformists declared the acquittal of John Gunn a travesty of justice. Slave uprisings had been happening for many years. Living conditions and harsh treatment were the catalyst for them. This painting shows the destruction of one of the plantations during one such uprising. Not long after that, John Gunn returned to Caithness, honoured his parents and brother with a memorial, and acquired a wife, Janet Oal. At first I had thought the couple returned to Jamaica, but there was no trace. I returned to my helpful book. According to memorials of Caithness ministers written by his nephew, in about 1841, Alexander Oal was requested by his sister to come out to Jamaica and manage the property which had belonged to her late husband. The voyage had lasted 6 weeks. By all accounts, Alexander enjoyed his work in Jamaica, admiring the beauty of the scenery and the quaint and childlike ways of the Negro population. He made this place, not far from Kingston, his home for a few years. Earthquakes and a near-fatal attack of yellow fever, coupled with a desire to devote his life to God, brought him back to Scotland, where he trained as a Free Church minister. By 1855, he was ministering as Free Church minister in the parish of Alrig. The same book tells us that his return to Scotland was circuitous. He apparently sailed back via Pictou, where he had good friends. Those of you familiar with the expression will know that friends or vriends in Caithness can mean relatives. Was this a clue for me? There is no record on the list of landowners in Jamaica of a John Gunn as a plantation owner, but there is a mention of the acreage number of slaves owned by a William Gunn until around 1817. Thereafter it's referred to as the estate of William Gunn, or belonging to the heirs of the late William Gunn. The name of the plantation appears to have been Wick. By 1851, there is also a reference to Captain Adam Gunn as a landowner, although there may not be any family connections between any of these guns. To cut a long story short, using Find a Grave site and the likelihood that any children of Jessie and John would have been called after the grandparents, I located the grave of a Catherine Innes Gunn White and other family members in Boston. It appeared that John Gunn and his new wife did not return to Jamaica after their marriage in 1834, as their children were all born in Pictou, Nova Scotia. He had bought property there and had private means, being referred to as John Gunn Gentleman. There were still lots of details to find out. If John Gunn didn't return to Jamaica, why was it necessary for the Reverend Alexander, his brother-in-law, to go there to manage his estate? Or does this expression merely imply winding up any remaining financial affairs? The Reverend Alexander Oal was said to have given up the prospect of a good legal career in Jamaica in order to join the church. Did he take over John Gunn's attorney duties? By this point in my investigations, I had encountered two relatives through Ancestry.com, also looking for John and Jessie Gunn's family. One was Marie Douglas in Australia, whose grandmother was a Nina Gunn. She and I decided to hire a professional researcher in Pictou who produced a wealth of information, including plans of all the properties owned by John and Jessie Gunn. There were 3 children, Catherine, Johnina and Jessie. I learned that on the death of John Gunn, Jessie, left with 3 young children, had remarried. She was now Jessie Ross. This tied up with the name Don Ross, who had presented the Trelawney sword to the Clan Gun Centre. Searching for the missing links with Australia, I tried the grandparent name trick again. John Gunn's father had been Aeneas. Up came not Aeneas, but Mrs. Aeneas Gunn, a popular Australian writer, famed for her book We of the Never Never, the story of her life with her explorer and pastoralist husband, who was son of the Reverend Peter Gunn of Tacher, John Gunn's brother, now of Melbourne. Here is the Reverend Peter Gunn's church in Melbourne. The bell in the church tower was a gift from Caithness, presumably the parishioners of Latheran Parish. And here is Peter Gunn outside his church. Marie Douglas had discovered that Nina, or Johnina, had come to Australia in 1855 on HMS Kent, a ship with a good reputation with passengers for a comfortable passage. Had Nina come all the way from Pictou on the Kent? Oh no. I found her living in Wick in 1851 with her grandmother, Janet Oal. For some reason we do not know, she chose to migrate yet again, this time to Australia, where she was welcomed into the bosom of the Gunn family down under. Eventually, Nina married a Simon Grant, the ceremony being performed in Melbourne by her uncle Peter. This tanker was presented to the chief officer of the Kent in recognition of a pleasant and comfortable passage from England to Port Phillip. I got a rap over the knuckles from my researcher. I had missed the obvious. His obituary was in the John O'Rourke Journal. It appeared that Jessie did not take long to find a second husband, nor did she have to look very far. She married the man next door, Hugh Ross. This is the brig Lady Grey, an emigrant ship taking settlers from Cromarty via Scrabster Roads, Thurso, and onwards to Nova Scotia. Run by agents John Sutherland of Wick, apparently no better than he should be, and Duncan McLennan of Inverness, it was a popular ship for people in the north. The ship had some 250 passengers in all, bound for Pictou and Quebec. In July 1841, it arrived with typhus on board. Because there was no hospital in Pictou, the passengers were removed to shore and presumably quarantined while the ship was cleaned. By September, 26 of the passengers had caught typhus and 6 of them had died. They were buried in the graveyard at Caribou Beaches. The health officer of the port also caught the typhus and died. Most of the passengers intended going on to Quebec. However, the majority of them couldn't be persuaded to get back on the ship, given what they had suffered already, and because they rather liked the look of Pictou. On the passenger list was Hugh Ross. It may well be that Jessie and John Gunn also used this route for their emigration trip too. The harbour buildings are now an interpretive centre. I felt quite protective of Jessie. Who was this man she had married? Was he suitable? Information in his birth certificate gave a great insight into the social status of his family. His mother is described as Mistress Jane Houston, obviously of some higher standing than usual. His father, Hugh Ross of Knockbreck. The witnesses were Captain Grant of Calrossie and John Ross of Demerara and Tain. John Ross was the owner of slave plantations on Berbice and Demerara, producing sugar. His cavalier attitude to his slaves is shown in his offering one up as a prize in a raffle and putting another, a well-trained cook and laundrymaid, up for sale in Tain, Rossshire, along with her mulatto son, said to be his own offspring. The slave trade from Africa was halted in the early 1800s, and slavery itself was outlawed from the British Empire, except India, in 1833, and the former slave owners were compensated for their losses. Captain Grant had been acting as a recruiting agent for settlers in South Africa. Propaganda for this government scheme included promises of wealth and status. Critics said it was all a ruse to get rid of poor people who would become a burden on the country. Captain Grant was prevented by circumstances from meeting a deadline for filling an emigrant ship. In fact, he was facing a court-martial. Those he had already drafted petitioned the Scottish Secretary, maintaining they had given up their jobs to join the captain and were now penniless and in need of support. Captain Grant replied that this was not the case and that the men had resumed their employment. He in turn petitioned Lord Bathurst, Secretary of State for the Colonies, on the grounds that he was now out of pocket. His request was turned down. Hugh Ross and Jessie went on to have a large family of their own, including one called Charles Edward Stewart Ross. Most of them moved to Boston and stayed in close contact with each other. Only Johnina emigrated quite such a distance. A happy extended family, you might think. But Hugh Ross's will had a codicil, banning his stepdaughters from participating, as he said, in any way, shape or form from his estate after the diabolical way they had treated him after all he had done for them from infancy. It had been John Gunn's wish that on his death his friend Alexander should be joined to executor along with wife Jessie. He declined this duty, however, as the distance from Halifax prevented him from doing so. Alexander was owner of a major brewery in Halifax, which is still Canada's largest. He came from Falkirk. And so, to answer the initial question, whatever happened to Janet Oal, she became Jessie Oal, and then Jessie Gunn, and latterly Jessie Ross. My curiosity over the fate of one family member sent me down roads I never dreamt of, from involvement in slavery at the time, to the urge to emigrate, undertaking perilous voyages, to the strong pool of family ties which stretched right across the world, and urbanisation. The Gunns and the Alls had had strong ties with the land. A generation later, and the family had dispersed to Boston, New York, and Melbourne.